Thank you, Heidi. Thank you for doing those introductions, and also thank you for all the amazing work you've done pulling together slide decks. This photo here is a good example of just Heidi's beautiful design work that she's done for a number of these panels. She's very talented, and I so appreciate her help. We also have a number of people on this call that are part of the BioArt and design teams. And shout out to you all. I think as a team, we've really worked hard to pull this track together, and it's through that kind of teamwork that we get this done. So thank you very much, everybody that's on here in a support position. We're kind of rolling, you know, off of the morning plenary, and so you're a bit familiar with what our subject matter is and the people speaking, but I want to go ahead and introduce them once again. We have Dr. Eben Kirskey here from Alfred Deakin Institute in Victoria, Australia. He's a writer, anthropologist, multi-species expert. He ran a really cool multi-species coronavirus reading group throughout the pandemic that has been incredibly informative. We have Dr. Susan Moenga, UC Davis Plant Science. She's from California. That should say Kenya, not Nigeria. I think I had the wrong country there. So she's back in Kenya. Just finished her PhD, and for those of you that I think you have been following what's going on in California, it's just been super intense with the fires for a 2-month period. And Susan was living in Davis, which was right at the cusp of where one of these major fires came to the edge of the town in Solano and burned part of the town down. So these are the conditions that, you know, she's finishing up her research. And I think that is very important to realize. These are the times that we're in right now as we speak. We have Dr. Kathy High, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York. Kathy is just a phenomenal pioneer in BioArt, multimedia studies. She's developed a terrific program at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York. I've spoken to Kathy throughout this shutdown, and am very aware of the struggle that interdisciplinary programs are having at this point to maintain funding, to keep their program going, to have access to the labs. And Kathy is certainly a historic pioneer in that, and is a big supporter of her students. We also have Dr. Giovanni Aloi from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I had the pleasure initially, well, Giovanni, I think we met at a School of Visual Arts lecture that we both gave a talk at with Suzanne Anker. And you gave a beautiful talk on plants, on palm trees in Italy and the dynamics of that. But Giovanni edits the online journal Antenna, a journal of animal and plant studies from the perspectives of art and art history. He did a really great series last summer called Experiment, specifically about bioartists and their practices. So we really have a wealth of talent and people who are here on this panel, and I'm so grateful that you all are here participating. I think if we could do the screen so we could see all 5 people at once for a little bit, that would be really wonderful.
I'm highlighting them. Let me know if they show up in your screen.
Okay. I can see each of them on the side. And I think maybe, oh, you probably need to unscreen share the slide.
Okay.
Okay, that's good. And then we want to try and get all 5 people. There's one, there's Kathy.
Hello.
Okay. Let me just
There's Eben.
find everyone.
And it's Eben, by the way, but that's okay.
Eben, I am so sorry. Let me get that right. Eben.
And I'm missing Kathy. Oh, here you go.
Got Giovanni. Well, we have everybody. We may just want to go, if we can't get it to, I think if there's a way of putting it in gallery view, that would be what would help.
I think that's on your end. You can put gallery view because I have here gallery view and speaker.
Okay, so you think I need to do that? That gives us everybody, let's see. Speaker. Okay, I don't know how we're going to do this, but let's go with speaker view here. So we're just going to continue on with the subject matter we were talking about earlier today, and we heard some really incredible thoughts about issues like fragile hopes, obsessions of purity, different elements like that in terms of our conversation. So I have a series of questions that I want to ask the panelists, and they'll each then respond for approximately 3 minutes, and we'll see how that goes. So my first question is a bit tongue-in-cheek. We're trying to look at everything from an organism point of view as opposed to a human point of view. And my first question is a statement: the world is out of balance for organisms due primarily to human impact. If we were perhaps in a psychiatry therapy session with both medical science and empathy tools on hand, trying to help the organisms lead a better life, and ask the question to the organisms, what do you want to see happen right now to make things better? How would they reply? So given agency, how would they remediate themselves? How would they create their own intact futures? Are they in fact doing this now? So that's the framework of the first question that we want to start with. And I think I'm going to throw it out to Giovanni to start us off, if you would.
Great, thank you. First of all, I'd like, if possible, it would be great to reverse the situation. I'd really love to see us answering questions in this context, and probably the organism would ask us, what is wrong with you, right? But responding to the brief, the way it was set up, I guess the two main issues that I think are relevant right now from the perspective of representation, which also create this chain of actions and reactions that shape our world, is the worrying about purity. And I think the organism would ask to stop entangling everything in our representational politics beyond the ecological well-being of the organism. So the organism would probably put forward a sense of deep discomfort and deep unease with our desire to read more than there really is in the relationship between humans and non-humans. And I think in that respect, if the organism is a plant organism, trying to shrink down the conception of organism here, it's hard to tell what the imbalance and what the situation might really be. We're probably giving for granted, according to the brief, that the organism is a patient that is in need of assistance or help. But as we know, there's a big question mark about climate change and how that's going to affect plants, and it's not necessarily wholly negative. And I just wanted to link this and perhaps the skepticism of the organism. Let's say that my organism is like reclining on the couch with a lot of skepticism. I think there's a question there about this intact that's been coming back over and over and over, because I think it doesn't exist. I don't think the organism wants it. I don't think we benefit from that notion, and it's ultimately part of what entangles everything. I think notions like intact, purity, also notions of preservations that have been explored in the previous talk earlier today, which were great in certain ways, but can be seen problematically in others. are part of this conversation that needs to be reconfigured. So ultimately, probably the plea of the organism is, can we reconfigure, please?
That's wonderful. Can you, so specifically in terms of what is problematic, and you're even saying the question itself is actually really problematic. Could you just say a small bit about, can you synthesize that? What is problematic? Literally, I know you just talked about that, but just kind of directly state that.
Well, literally, I think our inability to see beyond symbols and rhetoric, representational politics, when we approach subjects like nativism, decolonialization, and ecological questions. I think right now the organism would probably ask us to just try and see some clarity beyond those dimensions to really focus on what's important to the biosystems, to the biological dimension.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for that. Kathy, how would you see those issues? How would you say that yourself or pick up on issues Giovanni even has said?
Yeah, thanks very much. And I appreciate your kicking this off in that way, Giovanni, and the question is great, Carolyn. I have to backtrack 1 second and just out myself in that I'm not really a doctor, but I so appreciate being called one, and I can take on the mantle of a psychiatrist right now, I guess, to this in this moment that you've raised here and this question you've raised, Carolyn. But thanks for giving me that title. I love it. It happens often. I don't know what happens when you work with science. Suddenly they think you're a doctor. I'm like, okay, cool. You know, I agree, I think, with a lot of the things that Giovanni was pointing to, and that probably whatever organism I would have on the couch would probably tell me to do nothing. Like, let's just do nothing. Because I think we're seeing a lot of that evidence at this moment, in this COVID moment. And we've seen some amazing and remarkable returns of animals to urban sites, you know, plants taking over where we're not populating, you know, parking lots and things like that at this point. And the microbes are probably just going crazy. So I think that there's, you know, and certainly the virus is going crazy. We know that. So I think that while we always try to contain things and move forward, I also really like the idea of rethinking our ways of looking at things, recontextualizing how we think of things like toxicity, maybe trying to think through, and this might relate somewhat to what Giovanni was saying about purity. This notion of toxicity, I think we have to kind of question in terms of how toxic things really are and what relationship do the toxins have to us. Can we dismantle them in ways other than literally capping things or literally you know, applying other kinds of toxins to do so. So these alternative methods of looking at how organisms, you know, what they might want, we can never quite assume that we would know that. And I think they would understand that. They understand that inherently way before we do. One of the things that always interests me is trying to get people to think through the ecological systems that we are involved in. And that is both internal to ourselves and then external to everything else that we're working with. We're working with these systems that have had a much longer history than we have. We come out of their histories, and we need to have another level of respect and take away the kind of taxonomies that we've been applying to so-called species, et cetera, and think about things a little bit more holistically as we move forward, because I think that we have separated things, put us all into different disciplines, and we need to be thinking about things in an interdisciplinary approach so that we can ask, all of us can bring some kind of expertise to these questions, and then ask the microbes, the plants, the non-human animals to say to us, what do you want? It's a conundrum that I have been dealing with for a really long time in terms of trying to learn to address these things we call others when in fact they're really part of us. I think it's an ongoing question. So thanks for raising it.
Right, yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. So even the way that we classify things or the categories that we're putting them into is not an interrelated context and is very problematic. Susan, what do you think these organisms would say if they were sitting on a psychiatrist's couch?
Thank you, Caroline, and thanks everybody for being here. It's so exciting. It's such an important conversation. I think it's the thoughts that we don't often have, at least not personally, not at a personal level. I think the organism is saying, I'm here, look at me, I figured it out. I could teach you so many things, listen to me. I think the organism is saying, why are you imposing whatever you think is important on me? I know this, I've fixed it. One thing we've learned from plants, I can tell you, is that they're already pretty perfect. We want a lot of things from them, right? We want more of them, maybe, or less of them if they're weeds, for instance. But even for weeds, that's just a crop that has yet to be discovered. And for a lot of those plants in the ecology that they naturally exist, they've perfected the art of existing in that environment. And so very often our anthropogenic view of how these organisms should survive, what they should produce, in what quantities and in what quality, it feels a little bit unfair. And I can tell you again from chickpeas, some of the things we've learned. I spent a lot of time looking at wild relatives of chickpea to try and understand, perhaps in the process of domestication, what may we have left behind, what in that period about 10,000 years ago, when a lot of crops were getting domesticated and we were selecting on a very narrow set of traits that were important for human survival, for food and production and sustenance, that perhaps we left out, and we didn't think much about traits that contributed to longevity, both of the plant and the plant kingdom and the human species in a changing climate. So I think that the organism is feeling pretty frustrated and saying, I don't know why you're not listening to me. I can teach you a lot of things. Yeah.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Yeah, the longevity of evolutionary time and the decisions and the characteristics that are made within that context. Very good points. Eben, how are you thinking about this?
So the organism that I have with me on the couch today is the green and golden bell frog. And in thinking about and this is a frog that used to be all over the place. It used to live all over Australia, and it was so common that it was used in high school dissection classes and biology classes. But then it experienced these catastrophic declines in the 90s, and no one at that time really understood why. So populations were discovered in this strange place that is behind me right now. So on Monday, I had the privilege of talking to Kathy's biopunk students about this brick pit in Sydney. So this place that has histories of all kinds of pollution and toxicity. And as these frogs were declining everywhere else, and parks and places that didn't have pollution, they were flourishing here. And it became a conundrum. And going back to something that Giovanni said in the panel earlier about the problem of ventriloquism, speaking on behalf of others, you're often misrepresenting their interests. And in this place, I found that people were doing the wrong thing, but for the right reasons. And in part, Susan was just talking about the importance of listening or looking or learning from. And these frogs were doing really well in polluted environments. But the conservation biologists working here, and this is Sydney Olympic Park, they had the Green Olympic Games year 2000. It was a big deal, locally. They were trying to remediate these lands, make them into pretty, aesthetically pleasing parks. So they tried to create these special places for the frogs to live and protect them from the pollution and protect them from predators. But they didn't like it there. They liked it in the toxic waste. And I think, you know, in part, like who wants a future with toxic waste? Nobody, right? Like, but thinking about the conditions of possibility for a livable future for this particular frog amidst a global mass extinction event taking place in amphibians right now. So
Right.
the disease that was driving them extinct, we now can identify. It's a pandemic lineage of a chytrid fungus. And what was happening here is that the poisons, the heavy metals and all sorts of other things were toxic enough to kill the fungus, but not to kill the frogs. And the wrong thing that the biologists were doing, were trying to save the frogs. They were trying to keep them in protected places, but it wasn't the place that they were flourishing. So at the same time, we're thinking about these long-term evolutionary dynamics that drive kind of adaptation and change within stable niches. We're now living in a moment of incredible improvisation and change. So in those moments where we think we know what the right thing is to do, you know, I often want to hesitate between, you know, the moment when a problem is diagnosed and a solution is offered. And again, you know, Giovanni's insisting, like, we got to get past language. We got to think about ontologies. We got to think about ways that organisms are doing their own futures and bringing them into being. And at the same time, I think it's so critical right now to identify assemblages of death, right? So, you know, this place is great for the green and golden bell frog, and I think it should be preserved in its quasi-toxic state because of that. But at the same time, we need to seriously, reckon with these legacies of industrial pollution, those same legacies that are putting cancers into our bodies, that are killing so many other kinds of life. So while this one charismatic species that I have with me on the couch here today is flourishing in these conditions of impurity, we have to identify these necropolitical assemblages, these assemblages of industry, of empire, of colonialism that are dealing out unequal death. And we need to do this urgently. So I think the quick techno fix is, you know, often distracting from recognize, you know, Kathy talked about holisms and new interdisciplinarity. You know, we've got to reconfigure these systems of life and death on a planetary scale, and it's challenging because it's not a single company or type of doing industrial production, but it's this really complicated, multifaceted totality that we're dependent on. You know, like whether it's the, you know, carbon we're jetting into the air right now, but this is way better than all converging in Boston, right? But you know, we're still
that is so complicated in terms of what you're talking about, this assemblage of death and the ability of species to adapt. And this is really the big question in oceans right now, right? Is that whether things can adapt fast enough, whether coral will be able to adapt fast enough. And the conclusion is no. For the most part, these species just can't deal with the rate of change. So this is incredibly interesting. There was also a very interesting talk last night by Drew Endy about not having negative dreams, not having nightmare dreams, and the purpose of envisioning only positive futures in order to move us towards positive futures. And I think much of what you just said, I didn't necessarily agree with what he said. And I think some of what you're just talking about right here is looking at assemblages of death and what does that mean? And that we must look at those assemblages of death. That's wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
I'm going to move us to our second question here and keep us rolling with this. But this is a perfect segue into what our next question is, which is one concerning reworlding. So I want to ask the panelists, what does synthetic modification mean to you in regards to changing organisms or ecosystems? What does reworlding look like? What are your visions and concerns? What type of cultural and artistic practices might be involved as part of this dialogue? And as we're gathering here today of both bioartists and synthetic biologists, this way of looking at cultural meaning creating on multiple levels from both of those fields, I think really applies to this. So do we want to go in the same order? Does somebody else want to start? I don't care which order we go. Who would like to start us off here? Giovanni, I'm just going to come back to you. We can go in the
Yeah,
same
let's do
order.
it. Actually, I think my follow-up really, it's a nice segue to Eben's point. I think that's exactly, it's a fabulous example of what I think is our priority right now in terms of shifting the coordinates of our thinking out of rhetorics. It made me think of Donna Haraway and Teddy Bear Patriarchy in the sense that we need to step out of the logic of the Natural History Museum. And that essay has been around now for what, 50 years altogether, almost?
Yeah.
Was it 84,
Yeah.
85? I can't remember. And I use it regularly with my students because I know its power. It has changed the way I look at things. And the health of the organism is really what we need to prioritize right now. And the health of the organism, prioritizing the health of the organism doesn't mean necessarily conservation. It doesn't equate to the old rhetorics that we have inherited from colonialism, that we have passed on as tried and tested. Because as we all know, a lot of those rhetorics come from this idea of purity, comes from this idea of intact, that it's better and positive, ultimately just for our Garden of Eden complex. So that's the starting point of my answer, I guess. Mediating or facilitating the health of the organism in consideration of the limits and tensions that define the human-animal relations or human-non-human relations that we inhabit. And hopefully leaving these rhetorics behind us as much as possible. In relation to art and bioart, I couldn't, when I read the question, Caroline, I couldn't avoid but think of this quote by Eduardo Katz from many years ago. This is a quote related to Alba and GFP bunny that, you know, is very famous fluorescent bunny that was unleashed upon the world in 2000, causing a great controversy. In that context, Eduardo said that in the face of a great extinction, a mass extinction, it is the responsibility of artists to fill the world with new species. And I had the opportunity recently, it's probably last year, to just interview Eduardo for Antenne. And I did go back to that very statement, asking how humorous or deliberately provocative it was, or if he really meant it. And I don't think I got a straight answer, but it seemed to me that, you know, like a lot of what Eduardo does, there's an element of performance, an element of provoking that's essential to his art. And I feel like it's an interesting proposition because it brings us back to the very root of bioart, the tensions that surround bioart, the presence of the artist in a laboratory, and ultimately the role bioart can play, is allowed to perform in the real world. Is it just a museum piece that we can enjoy behind the screen that's safe? Or is it something that can actually impact? I'm also thinking Natalie Jeremy-Jenko is probably another great example of somebody who actually works in the environment with, you know, interactions with living organisms like trees. And I think that's a different kind of ontological conversation she establishes with the non-human. And of course, I think of Spela Petric. There's so many interesting examples where the inside, like, let's keep it contained to the laboratory and emphasize the performative, and the outside, let's actually take bioart outside and make it interact with the environment, are different, important, and urgent points to address in the context of what bioart can accomplish.
Yes, beautifully said. Yeah, how do we use art to address these concepts with that? And there's a strong history in bioart of doing specifically like that. I remember when you were doing this interview with Eduardo, because you were writing the antennae experiment thing right around that time. And I remember talking to you about some of those issues. So I appreciate you bringing those up. Yeah. Kathy, what do you have to say about this? What kind of concepts of reworlding do you think about?
Oh, yes. Okay. Let me jump in here and just talk about this idea of artists, you know, kind of speculating on new creatures, new new ways forward and working outside the lab. I think these are all really important things for artists to do, for researchers in general to do, scientists. I think that when we're thinking through things like synthetic biology and genetic engineering, things that are on people's minds quite a bit right now, I want to go back to Aaron Katz from Symbiotica, because I think that, Aaron has been raising kind of a cry about this field for a long time, in that it's the marriage of engineering with biology. Right. And this is a really interesting moment and possibility for making great changes. It's also applying sometimes, I think, a kind of fix-it mentality, which I think can be really problematic. And so I think that these kinds of provocations that Eduardo and other artists are throwing out there offer up ways of kind of maybe questioning what that mentality means. So I do appreciate this kind of criticism of this synthetic biology moment and how others can intervene in that. I also think about things like returning to a very hyper-local situation for all of us. We are in this now with the lockdown. Many of us are really in place. And what does that mean to be in place, and looking at our own environments and what the results of that are? I work very closely with a nonprofit organization in North Troy called the Sanctuary for Independent Media. Mediasanctuary.org is their website. And I've been working with them for a long time to start an environmental education center called Nature Lab. And its main focus is to look at the environment of this area of North Troy, which is an incredibly ecologically and economically devastated area. Because I think this notion of rewilding sometimes goes back to kind of colonialist ideas and ideas of being able to, fix things, as I will return to the engineering mentality. And so one of the things that we're doing at Nature Lab is to look at the quality and the pollution that has been a part of this industrial area in North Troy, in the soil and the air and the water, and to develop the means, literally a community lab, to investigate how we can change our relationship to that, and how we can begin to educate ourselves, and how we can begin to put tools, DIY tools, into people's hands to do these kinds of investigations. I think these are things that artists do all the time, and I'm really proud of that fact. And I'm hoping that these kinds of skills, and scientists and makers do it as well, but I'm hoping this will be also happening in North Troy. The lab is opening in the spring.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, shouts out to North Troy. That's incredible. I can't help but think that you also had Adam Zaretsky as one of your PhD students, and he has some pretty incredible notions about reworlding and often really provoking kind of thoughts. So there's a lot of interesting things that have come out of your program there.
Thanks. I think I was more a student of Adam's than Adam was a student of mine, but thanks. Yes.
Yeah. Susan, I see you nodding your head on some of these issues. What is it that you think about this concept of reworlding? And for you, you're the scientist on this panel, and I think as part of the Creative Culture Pod with the BioFellows, we really talked about this notion of creating or manifesting new forms on multiple levels, not as just art, but that art, in fact, could be crop development. So what are some of the thoughts that you have here?
Well, so I'm nodding my head because I think everybody's bringing up really important points and just so interesting. And one of the things I struggle with is that traditionally the way academia is set up, and particularly in science and life sciences specifically, we are taught and we're trained to have a reductionist approach. And so, you got to take out all the noise in order to understand that little system that you're studying. And you understand it so well but then you understand it exclusive of the rest, which in the natural environment it exists in, right? And so in a way, we've gone from, say, when you think about, you know, genetic engineering and synthetic biology, we've gone from thinking about single gene modification to, you know, gene pyramiding, and now we talk about CRISPR being able to splice full chromosomes, and this work came out from Chin Lab last year, from Cambridge, and it's so exciting when you think about these opportunities and all the things that you could do, you know, for specific organisms of human interest. And unfortunately, for the most part, we think about these tools, again, specifically for the organisms that we are considering and we're interested in, and rarely do we think about the ecosystem and perhaps, you know, what could be changing as we change one single thing in a single organism. And so I really liked that Kathy introduced the dysbiosis idea in the morning. And so I can, you know, in plants, we are obviously beginning to understand how important the microbiome is, for instance. And because I've worked with legumes, and in legumes we know that because they're this really phenomenal members of the ecosystem, because they've really articulated the art of mutualistic existence. So, you know, legumes, they associate with symbionts, with specific microbes that allow them to fix nitrogen for the plant while they give the microbe carbon. So they have to have an agreement on how this relationship functions. And when one doesn't reach that end of the deal, well, you know, something is going to fail, right? And so they're in perfect harmony. And when some things change, whether it's in the microbe or in the plant, well, something's going to go wrong, right? Because someone is going to fail in this agreement. And so if I was thinking about improving chickpea, say, to get more, a specific type of protein in abundance, you would think that I would want to think about what that specific microbe it associates with, thinks about this whole, you know, idea of shifting something, however little, seemingly, on the plant side, but rarely have we really given it that much thought at ecosystem level. And that has been to a certain disadvantage. So when I think about rewilding, I would actually think more about rewilding. So going back again and asking, in natural systems, how do these organisms exist? Who are they in association with? And when I think about changing something in one organism, is there something else I need to do? Because naturally, they've been co-evolving. So how do I match what's happening in the natural system?
Beautiful. Rewilding. Yeah. Incredible. All right. Eben, we're running a little bit short on time with our questions, but I know that this is a prime area of writing in which you have a lot to say. So see what you can cram into 2 minutes here of your entire thesis of your books.
Well, I think I'll just build on something that Susan was just saying, you know, about symbiosis as an agreement, and also maybe destabilize conventions of ethics as they pertain to synthetic biology. So Giovanni mentioned Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, and in her latest book, Staying with the Trouble, she talks about the Camille stories, which are a parable about an intergenerational group of children that are genetically modified to care for the monarch butterfly. So in that parable, she insists that the butterfly shouldn't be modified. You know, we don't want to sort of foist the risks on to these other organisms, but we need to take on new risks to our organism, the human organism, to accommodate ourselves to the worlds of others. So I was in close dialogue with Donna as I was finishing the Meetin project, and you know, I was talking to her about Dr. Ha's experiment, you know, this experiment that was trying to promote the lives of marginalized queer people in China and in the US, and I really expected that she would, you know, think that it was interesting and maybe not celebrate it, but at least sort of agree in principle. You know, the classic Haraway essay, Promises of Monsters, is about forging new kinds of symbiotic attachments with HIV as the figure, and thinking about not only symbiosis among organisms, but the symbiotic arrangements that need to take place between technologies and legal systems. But anyway, we had a really interesting disagreement that I relate in the book, where, and kind of reflecting back, like she's basically insisting, like, we need to stop paying so much attention to human health and well-being and really refocus the orientation of these technologies to account for these multi-species worlds. So reworlding, I guess, in this context is thinking about the changes we might make to ourselves to enable better futures. And I also want to give, Adam came up earlier. So Adam has some fantastic visions. And Adam was my buddy at the Human Genome Editing Summit in 2015, not the famous one.
Oh my goodness, yeah, you guys went. That was fantastic to have artists there.
Yeah, and so he had these amazing visions on the sideline of the summit that then in a strange way got articulated from the main stage by these straight-laced biologists. So that's in the book too.
That is really great. Yeah, Adam definitely knows how to be provocative in very, the things he brings up are very interesting. Did you do your PhD work at the History of Consciousness with Donna Haraway?
Yeah, I did. I was Jim Clifford was my advisor. It was Donna Haraway was on the committee, as was Anna Singh.
Super cool. That's really great. All right. Yeah, I'm just a quick comment about who needs to be modified. I get that comment a lot from my kids. It's not their behavior that needs to change, it's mine. So, these power relationships of what we take for granted are on multiple levels there. We have maybe 5 minutes to do our last round of questioning, because I want to leave 10 minutes at the end for, I'm sure people are just ripe with questions for all of you guys. So I want to do a lightning round here about an idea that came from Kathy in terms of the idea of how do we create communities of care around these issues? That if we are in such a dire crisis time, it's not an individual solution that's going to get us there. And it's not just community, it's specifically communities of care. So Kathy, I'm going to let you start us out with this, and everybody I'm going to give you a sign after you've done 1 minute. Okay, we're just going to go really quick. So, all right, Kathy, take us off.
Thanks, Carolyn. And actually, while I've been working with care for a number of years, this term communities of care comes from our wonderful colleague and philosopher, Maria Antonia Gonzalez from Mexico City. Yeah. So I have to credit her with that. And she's amazing. And this is a concept that's come up at FEM meetings, where we've been talking about the need to really think about how what Susan was saying about listen to each other and listen to the other organisms too, and think about these communities of care. And just as a nod to this event that's coming up later tonight that Jennifer Willett is doing, the gratitude ceremony to the organisms, I'm just going to read a quick quote from her event tonight, which she very generously shared with me. We're in an exhibition together, so we've been writing back and forth quite a bit, and have written together love letters. So here's from hers. There's a feeling, and this is Jennifer speaking, there's a feeling I have sometimes about the unfurling of the universe, sometimes about lineage, family, fraternity, love, entropy, and even vitalism or biophilia. The feeling is probably love, but not the kind of love we see in Hollywood films or read about in romance novels. I mean, an awesome sensation of love for oneself and all other beings hurtling through the universe on our shared spaceship Earth. So it's a little awkward reading this in front of you, Jennifer, but it's going to be a great event. Come see it tonight. And, those are some thoughts on care, communities of care.
Beautiful. Yeah, great event coming up tonight. Susan, what do you think about communities of care?
I would say I struggle with this question a little bit. I think that we've gotten the GMO movement, especially on the food side of things, the crop side of things, there are a few things that we've gotten wrong. And part of that has largely been that we haven't been able to communicate clearly to the things that we're doing and the potential impacts in our food production systems that they would have. but largely part of it has been, there have been a lot of silent voices that should have been heard. And I think that if those voices were valued significantly, that this would be a different dynamic that we deal with. There's something someone said in the morning during the plenary session, I think it was Radha Krishna. She said, during Kevin's talk, she said, this is the problem often seen in policy making. The most vulnerable populations are usually lost in statistics.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like when in synthetic biology, obviously, we are speaking from a very human angle. And right now we're having a great conversation about how to listen to all the organisms, how to think about, what the rest of the system is, potentially saying. I think that perhaps we should also think about what the other humans, the other part of the globe that's often ignored is saying about their own food systems, about their own biota, about their own diversity, what they would like to see improved, what they'd like to be left alone. They've been left out in decision-making processes. I think care can only begin when diversity is a very important part of the conversation. And I'm talking about diversity both in the target of the organisms that we think are interesting, but also in the decision-making processes from the human point of view.
Absolutely. The issue of who's at the table and who is at the table in terms of education. And I know also you've talked a lot about even what crops are selected, whether they're crops that are meaningful to the people in the countries that are growing it, or whether they're crops that are for export kind of stuff. So all wonderful thoughts about when we even begin to think about communities of care, what does that mean on a human to human level? Yeah. Eben and Giovanni, I'm going to give one of you the option of answering to this question, and then we'll move into questions. So who feels really passionate about this?
I can
Giovanni, go.
Do you want to go, Giovanni?
I'm going to have you go, Giovanni.
I can be super quick. My perspective here is with regards to pushing the institutions. Like, we really need to change the minds of our curators, the big museums. Their agenda about climate change is not where the discourse should be. And places like this, Antenna, the community, the real communities at this level. And we need to kind of help the bigger institutions reconfigure their dialogues and getting their hearts in the right place about this.
All right, Eben, go. Thank you.
I stopped thinking about it because I thought I was off the hook.
I know.
I think,
Okay,
care in multi-species communities in part is about who is in the world. Caring for another in community can be the difference between sort of death and life and even extinction. So I think learning to love the unloved in these multi-species worlds is the critical project of the time. And, who to love is a foundational question. And I think having an organism on the couch today is one way of, getting us to each think about that, but also how to love and how to care. So care for one often means death to another, and owning up to that violence in multi-species worlds and coming to those new symbiotic agreements, to come back to Susan's language, I think is kind of the critical project.
Yeah, thank you. And just inserting once again Susan's comment about that it's on a human-to-human level about when decisions are made in favor of one person, it's leaving out another group of people. And so this is on multiple levels that our systems of care need to be multiplicitous and reevaluated with that. Hey, you guys, that was fantastic. I want to throw this out to the audience, and Heidi, if we could maybe put it to view where we could see everybody on the things. And I don't know if that's me that needs to do that. I can try that. There we go. All right. If you want to ask a question, let's just informally just unmute yourself and start talking. If two people talk at once, we'll get to the next person. Who has a question for one of our panelists? We have 10 minutes left for questions, so that's great. Who would like to ask a question? And you can also raise a blue hand. I can see that now. If anybody'd like to ask a question, you can also type one in chat if you'd like to. You guys, I know you have some questions here.
We can just keep talking.
We can. What we're going to do is we're going to have panelists ask other panelists. Well, actually, Jennifer Willett has a question here. Let's see what she has to say. Jennifer.
Oh, there. Okay, it worked. All right. So one of the dilemmas that a lot of us have in the bioart field, and I'd love to hear from the panelists about this, is about the conflict between wanting to perpetuate this type of work and then maybe the violence and use value and environmental sort of impact of these practices. So I'd love to hear more about this, like this idea of this complicated relationship between attempting to care for or show care in one area and then therefore maybe even annihilating someone else as it's applied to bioart practices.
Great question. Who would like to answer that?
Eben, start. You got it.
No, you go, Kathy.
We have very polite panelists. What do you think? Let's see, I'm gonna throw it out. What do you think, Eben?
Seriously, Kathy, go. Like I was
Kathy,
actually
go.
I saw Paige's hand was up with a new question, so I was like, Paige, you should type your question in the box, but I wasn't listening properly. So Kathy, please.
Yeah, Kathy, do you want to roll with that?
Well, okay, so if we're thinking about these kinds of questions, and Jennifer, thanks for that. You know, I think one of the things that bioartists, and we're coming back around to this again, do really well is kind of provoke how these questions should be situated. So I think the best that bioart can do is to put in front of us the kind of dilemmas that your question would raise. Has been cited, Adam Zaretsky is somebody who, you know, pushes, for example, this idea of mutation and the ethics around that. For example, project he did with young embryos, bird embryos, and introducing toxicity to those embryos. This is all something that is really valid within the kind of animal care and animal oversight that happens within universities and other institutions. But once that organism is born, the experiment has to be, that actually has to stop before it's born. So these kinds of dilemmas of how, what about that, you know, and then the kind of questions that come up about thinking about our own bodies and our own ideas around choice and abortion rights in light of all of that those kinds of provocations that Adam's raising. This raises a huge number of ethical questions that when these things are introduced, the artwork, hopefully at its best, it will begin to ask those questions and begin to point, not necessarily point fingers, but point to the dilemmas that we have in front of us. Because I think that taking on biotech at this point is pretty tough to do for us individuals. I don't know, I'll stop there. That's enough for me. Eben, go for it.
I just wanted to make a super quick citational shout out to a book, Tactical Biopolitics, which is on these issues, exposing biopolitical relations and re-articulating them. It's in the chat.
Nice, thank you, Evan. Paige, you had your hand up. I'd like to get to your question.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking of the human body and the fact that it hosts other millions of organisms, and that just even being aware of that might, I mean, how much do we feel like it could affect our understanding of other outer organisms, just even focusing in on ourselves? And it's a thought more than a question, but I just, yeah.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Anybody have a response to that, or does anybody have other questions they'd like to ask?
I could just, you know, chip in a perspective. It's an interesting point of view, and my answer is I don't know. I have been scratching my head, working for big museums. Like when I lived in London, I worked for Tate. Now I work for the Art Institute of Chicago, and also, you know, my teaching. you really see the disconnect between the conversations we're having here and the wavelengths of the outside world. It appears clear. You can look at the same work of art with your students, informed by the readings that we all know, and we all spiral out of control in beautiful conceptions of a future that could be better. And the general public out there is on a different wavelength most often. I don't want to generalize, and I don't want to hierarchize it either. But sometimes I do wonder about what it is. What are the handles that we can use from our side of the conversation to open the doors that, you know, have a handle at the other end, if that makes any sense. And I find that point you've made, Paige, very fascinating. I think it needs to be put across in a certain way. It needs to be harnessed in a context that can really, because we've been talking about this idea for a while, but I don't really know how much it has percolated out there. So that the question of engagement remains paramount to this.
Yeah, absolutely. I see a question in the chat from Alexandra Guinness, and it's saying, how do I deal with allowing destruction within the framework of care? And I think this really goes back to the final plenary panel by that we had last night in terms of this idea of nightmare versus dream. So who would like to address that? How do I deal with allowing destruction within the framework of care?
Maybe I'll just quickly jump in. I think destruction at multiple scales is kind of an inevitable fact of life, but there's also a kind of destruction that we're living through that you can see in sort of cataclysmic events, whether it's the Deepwater Horizon explosion that took place in the Gulf of Mexico, or the current fires in California, or last year in Australia. And you know, these ongoing events that are at such a scale where it's clear now that power or the world isn't functioning predictably in sort of a homeostatic state. And I think that gives rise to new communities of care, new, you know, solidarity networks, but also contagious hopes that are about reconfiguring the system as it is and imagining better futures that might be. So I think holding nightmare and utopia together is really important to give a counterpoint to Andy.
That's a beautiful note to end on: contagious hope and holding nightmare and dreams together. And I really think it's the job of artists to do both of those kind of things. So thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, panelists. Thank you to all of you who are involved with thinking about these issues and cared enough to show up today. I think artists and cultural engagement along these kind of philosophical lines is very critical to our future thinking as a planet. So thank you all.